Hi everyone, I'm Pedro Velhinho. I'm the host of Web Access Matters, a podcast on digital accessibility. And I'm very excited to be joined by Gareth Williams. He's an advocate on accessibility worldwide. He's a champion of accessibility also. And he started his career on BBC, where he kind of revolutionized the way that people consume content, entertainment, and information particularly. So join me while we discuss user feedback and how to approach EAA, how organizations can tackle these guidelines, also ADA and so many others around the world. We do have some tangents along the way, but stay tuned and hope you enjoy it. Gareth, welcome. Let me be the first to welcome you to the first podcast of Web Access Matters. It's a pleasure to have you. And before we start, I just wanted you to run something by, because it's been interesting to ask ChatGPT about you. Let me see if I can. Yeah, it's been interesting listening to what she has to say about you.
No.
Yeah, let's go. Hey GPT, who is Gareth Ford Williams?
Gareth Ford Williams is an expert in digital accessibility, best known for leading the accessibility efforts at the BBC. He's dedicated to making digital content more inclusive and works on projects that help organizations improve their accessibility standards and user experience.
Gareth, what do you have to say about this?
Thank you, but thank heavens for that, because the amount of grief I give AIs is... and the amount of whinging I do about how they're used, it's like at least she's not taking it personally.
No, she was nice to you. She was very nice to you. Yeah.
Yeah, you cut her off just before she got to the next bit.
Yeah, I told her I was going to do that. Yeah, I know. No, but it's amazing. It's amazing that it's inevitable, right? Connecting you with BBC, it's one of those things. Although, and I also wanted to jumping into the question is that when I was researching you, one of the first things that GPT told me is that, okay, Gareth has ADHD and is dyslexic. And I was thinking, oh, okay, that's good information, but why are you telling me this? It's BBC, ADHD. It's the two things that kept popping up with your name. And I can't, I can't, I mean, I do have to ask is, does that have anything to do with the way that you look at accessibility? The way that does that any?
I don't know. I think we all bring our own kind of personal lens to what we do, because we've all got different reasons why we work in accessibility, and the way I think about things, I think is a combination of things. And I put it down to my own personal history. So kind of I most of my childhood was growing up on a residential school for disabled kids with complex needs, and which my dad previously, my mum for a while, but my dad was the headmaster there. My mum taught there for a while as well, and we lived there. And from age 2, there were a lot of friends that I grew up with, and that was great because the kids lived there. They went home at the weekends, but during the week we all, sort of played together, and we ate meals together. We went on holiday together. We did all sorts, and it was just part of my upbringing. And so, I don't like the word normal, but it was my normal.
Right.
That growing that family, and and I think also, and I attribute various different bits and pieces to my approach to accessibility. I think also being an art student for 5 years, I think helped as well, because being, they're my 2 diagnoses officially. I've been armchair diagnosed by many people, especially ex-members of my team on stage, when they thought they were when I was stood next to them and they thought they were getting away with it by only saying my manager, and the entire 400 people in the audience knew exactly who their manager was, and then talking about other things. And I was like, yeah, thanks for that. It was very funny. And that person themselves is autistic. And as they left the stage, they just whispered to me, I think I got away with that. I was like, I don't think you did. Really. I don't think
That's
anyone got
hilarious.
away with that. It was very funny, but I think being an art student as well really helped me, because that was my first love, was sculpture and painting and creative arts, because it was really, you're learning to work without a brief. It's the difference between if you went to be a design student, then you have a brief. There's a purpose for what you're designing, a thing for an end use, for an end goal. Whereas fine art exists for the purpose of itself. It's there maybe to be part of a discourse around an idea. It might be there to express something that's a bit more esoteric than that, or more conceptual than that. But at the end of the day, it's up to you. There is no brief for fine art, and I think that is always, I think working without a brief is a really important thing in accessibility, because it helps you find better questions.
That's interesting.
With the questions, we often go straight into solution mode, and it's like, let's fix the thing, and it's like, do we know it's broken? Do we? What do we know about this? And let's stop for a minute and talk about what it is that we're trying to do here, and for whom and why, and delve into that before we start going in. So I think maybe there's a little bit about the way that I'm wired. Maybe it's a little bit about the way that I think. I think a lot of it is about the way that we're brought up, and and all of that has shaped my approach, I suppose, in a way. So it's an interesting question. I've not really get asked that very often, so that's that's very cool.
No, but you actually gave me like an amazing segue, because if you bring that into accessibility, and if you actually start wondering why, right? Well, why are we doing this? Do we actually need to do this? My next question is inevitable. Is okay. So you go on to BBC, and do you start asking questions? Like, do you remember what questions were you asking?
It's a funny one, because I joined the BBC by accident, and as one does, I turned up for interview practice and accidentally got the job, and which wasn't the idea. It was purely, and it wasn't for anything to do with accessibility, because I went from fine art, then became a dad very happily, and then went and got a proper job, got my hair cut and got a proper job. And it's the kind of way it works. But it's I went to work in advertising, went in ad agencies, and lots of people creative go into that side, and then design agencies, and then eventually I joined the BBC as a brand manager, and it was kind of interesting, because I was still running a creative team, so it was kind of an odd hybrid role. And so I had a small creative team, and we were doing sort of broadcast branding and TV trails and things, and at the same time dealing with audience data, because that's what brand managers do. We sit and worry about how people felt about things. Did we drive the right audience? What are they going to say about it? How do they come back? What do they feel about it? And very much emotional data around things, and it was really kind of a sort of a chance that I got involved with this, because it was literally a chance conversation that was unrelated really, with a guy that actually I didn't know at the time that he was controller of bbc.co.uk, but it was someone asks me about it, and about what I think of bbc.co.uk, and I didn't think a great deal of it, actually, in some ways. So at the time, my son was 6 years old, so this was 20 years ago, and he was 6 years old. He has quadriplegic cerebral palsy, and he could play the games for the 0 to 6 year olds, but he couldn't play the games for older. And he was transitioning out of those, those little kids games, from CBeebies, which is the under 6 brand for the BBC, to CBBC, which is from 6 to 12. And it's like, and I wasn't very happy about that, because from a brand manager's point of view, you've just built a relationship up with a child and dropped them age 6. You know what? That's you're supposed to carry this through the brands, through their journey. They grow up with the BBC, and you're supposed to support that. And so that was something I said, and I think I've also brought up that I thought that the homepage seemed to be designed around politics rather than users. You could tell just by the way that things were given priority who had the most money and the biggest personality, and it kind of sparked a conversation, because it was interesting because the BBC must have, I don't know, an older accessibility program for an organisation than the BBC's, because the BBC started out pretty much as an employment scheme for engineers coming back from World War One. Telecoms engineers and communications engineers and stuff. And it was their idea to turn, wartime technology, communications technology, into a peacetime service, and build a national radio network. I don't think there was such a thing anywhere in the world as a national radio network at the time. Worked with Marconi, I believe it was, who were brought in, and with all of these people who had limb differences, PTSD. The first director general had been shot in the face, so he had one eye missing. I think he may have been vision impaired in the other, and so it was just one of those. They designed and created this technology in this network, and then they built a corporation to put programming on it, and they got involved with setting up a charity, which the BBC fundraised for years and years, called Wireless is for the Blind, because they immediately recognised that blind people needed wireless sets that they could operate by touch alone and find the BBC programme and all sorts of stuff. It was really fascinating. And then they invented InVision they first did signed programming for children, adults, and for news interpretation in about 1957. I think they started with that. And I don't know how accurate this story is, but the story I heard was that it all started out because there was a news director whose best friend who'd grown up with next door was a BSL speaker, this other kid, and he couldn't access any of the news on the BBC. And he was like, well, I'm the news director. And he just stuck a sign interpreter next to, I can do what I like. I'm the director. I'm direct. This is my op. And everyone went, this is a really interesting idea. And it grew out of someone who just did that for a friend. And then suddenly you realize it, and then they did news for the deaf, and they started trying out things. And then in the 60s, I think 1969, the year I was born, gives away my age. So they were creating the teletext platform, obviously the world's first platform for text-based information. And they built the capability for closed caption subtitling into the original spec. And it was a guy there was two people. There was Professor Alan Neil, and I can't remember the name of the other chap. It's gone completely out of my head. But yeah, Alan Neil was extraordinary, and he had this idea of putting words on the screen for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, and then they launched the first closed captioning service. I think WGBH did open captioning somewhere in the early 70s, but closed captioning was BBC was the first one, which was late 70s, 79. And then they got involved with the ITC and ITV and other organizations in the late 80s and 90s to develop audio description. And so brilliant. Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. And I wasn't the first person to point this out, but it didn't seem like anyone had a plan. And through lots of discussions that went on, which would go on for ages to tell you how complex and how boring the whole thing was, but somehow it ended up as my problem. And it was like, you started this. It's like, you do it. You take care of it. And we went to the exec, and we got complete buy-in from the execs. They were like, yeah, of course we should do this. Absolutely, the BBC's for everyone. And then they gave me a little team. I was able to, a little budget. They said, build a little team. And because I said to them, we there wasn't really WCAG or anything like that in those days that was anything really that was usable. So being a brand manager, let's start with people. We were always on about your audience data. Let's go and talk to the audiences. Let's understand the barriers, their frustrations, and let's think about how we're going to design around these. And there was a little project that was kicking off. It had been around for about a year, but it was going into a new phase. And they said, well, this might turn into something. Join that, build everything into that, becomes your playground for research. Let's find the things out in one space and then work out how we then take this to the rest of the organization. And that project became BBC iPlayer. So this is why iPlayer launched completely accessible, because the exec said we need it as at least as accessible as TV. So we had to get audio description and subtitling and all the rest of it, and closed caption subtitling and InVision signing in from the beginning. But then we also needed to get people to the content. So there's no point in having accessible content if no one can actually get to it. Yeah. What's the point of that? So then we then worked that. Now, brilliant team. And then it just all built out from there, really.
And do you remember, like, what was the, I wouldn't say the biggest challenge, but the one thing that you kind of thought, okay, this is possible, and then from brainstorming, or I don't know, you kind of overcame that, like, because the BBC is huge, has been huge for a long time. It's like the website is just humongous, if there's a word for that. So how do you tackle that in a way that you guarantee pretty much that everything is accessible every single
you can
page,
never guarantee that everything. Give me anything in the world and I'll find you someone who can't use it. It doesn't matter what the object. There's no such thing as 100% accessibility, because nobody can define that. And because people are complicated, and it's not just about a physical ability or a cognitive ability. It's about our knowledge and our experience, and we bring all sorts of culture. All sorts of things can create different perspectives, which are socioeconomics is a big accessibility concern. I'll get onto that in a bit, but it's something no one ever talks about. And it always, well, actually, there are a few people that do talk about it, and they talk about it brilliantly, but it's not talked about enough as it should be. And it's so. Yeah, there was always things, but scale is a thing that has always fascinated me, and and a lot of the practices, although they can be effective, don't scale or are not sustainable. They're about dealing with a problem now, and they don't build sustainability. And an organization needs to be able to do this for themselves. It needs to become part of everything they do. A wonderful designer called Dieter Rams, who wrote the principles of product design in the late 60s, early 70s, and I think he mentored Johnny Ives at Apple, and which is why Braun, and there's a lot of the philosophy from Braun products in the 60s made its way into Apple products, and still there. And Dieter said this wonderful thing, and he said, and I'm going to slightly misquote them. I can never remember the exact wording, but he said along the lines of, "There's the one and only cardinal sin in design is not designing for the reality in which people live." And everything is in there, because our needs and our preferences, be functional or emotional, are our reality. That is our experience of design, and we often don't think about this. Who gets a designed experience is a question. And it is about designed experience. It's not a compliant thing. It's not. Oh, don't get me on checklists, because
we'll get to that. We'll get to that.
Oh. I understand why they need to exist, but I actually, at the same time, it really grates with me that they exist. They have to exist, but because they're not designed, and it is about designed experience. And I can't remember the question. Oh, failure. So we used to get, but the whole point was, we would go through, how many crises can we have in a week? So by the end was, how few crises do we have in a year? And I think comparatively, by the end of my term at the BBC, we were having the same amount of crises in a year that we had in a week at the beginning. And it was taking that whole thing down. And it was not about policing. Wouldn't police, I don't like auditing. These things do not scale. And it can be effective, but I always feel like auditing feels like a hammer. And when you've got a hammer with the word audit on it, then everything starts to look like a nail, and you just go around hitting everything. And it's like, really, is that going to win people over? Even the word is rude. I mean, hey Pedro, hi Gareth, I've just come to audit you. I know the two words that are going to follow that, and the second one's off.
Exactly.
I'm not going to come here and tell you how to do your job, and I find that whole thing it jars with me, and I know that at times it's useful, and we can learn things, and WCAG is full of very, very, very useful things written by clever people, but it's not it's not design. It's just a place where really good techniques are captured, and without there's not particularly any data, but that's another thing. But there's there's best practice and really good thinking by very clever people. But yeah, but yeah, the failure thing was always that whole thing, and the BBC still gets it wrong, like every organisation. And you're right, scale is enormous. I think it's still in the top 30 largest digital estates in the world. It's massive, and it's got 750 million weekly users. Is it weekly? Yeah, it's something ridiculous like that in 44 languages. It's massive. It's absolutely massive. And we never had more than 10 people working on accessibility.
So I don't know why weren't you able to take care of every page? I don't know why 10 people for X thousand pages.
because we didn't. It was that whole thing: is how do we do this in a way where we don't have to be there? And if there's I used to curse every single time I talked about semantics. It's like, oh, we're here again. Why are we talking about link text or anchors or anything again? This stuff should just happen. And absolutely. But most of the time, people don't know what it is that they're supposed to be doing. I'm doing a thing today. How do I do it? And then someone says, look at WCAG, and they look at it, which is the singularly most unusable thing on the internet. And which is kind of ironic, isn't it? It's supposed to be and then they look at it and just go, that's a nightmare. I haven't got 3 weeks to figure this out. And they go away. And project managers look at it and go, I don't know, what's the definition of done here? Don't know, defer it, we'll do a best endeavor. Or they buy a tool that promises things that it can't necessarily deliver fully, and there's so much confusion around this. And I just think it is hard. People say, oh, accessibility isn't hard. It is hard. It's really hard to do. It's but that's because of the approach. And and absolutely
afterthought. It's completely an afterthought. When things are done. Oh, by the way, should we? No, not right now. You should have done that in the beginning, the planning stage. Otherwise, it's just going to fall apart.
And that is right. It's the planning stage, is that whole thing, and it's that again, asking good questions at the beginning. And so there's a good friend of mine who I used to work with at the BBC, is part of the team, called Jamie Knight. And Jamie and I used to run a little session, which I absolutely loved, with product teams. And it was that whole thing is, accessibility is 100% delivered before you start designing anything. Okay, we start from a point where it's just an idea. Anything is just an idea. It's just a brief, an idea, or whatever. Everyone, it's 100% accessible at that point. It's equal because it's just an idea to everyone. Then we start designing the thing that delivers it, and we start building it, and then we start making decisions that remove accessibility as a potential. Barriers are created. They're only taken away if they're created in the first place. So let's take responsibility for that at the beginning and say, A, how do we avoid creating barriers? And B, if we are going to exclude, who are we willing to exclude? And I think exclusion is a perfectly valid thing in a design approach. And it sounds mean and rotten and horrible, but no, fine. There are people that we may not be bothered about if they can access things, and there's good reasons. So this was a great little workshop we used to do called "Who Are We Willing to Exclude?" And literally we would ask that question, and then the second half of the workshop is who gets a designed experience, because everyone that we're not willing to exclude has to be designed for, and that's when you deal with it. So a really easy example is you're building a news application, which is great. Right, fine. We know what that's about. It's going to be UK only, and it's going to just be in, British native languages, 4 native languages in the UK. And so the BBC, for its domestic services, that only has the permission to do the 4 native British languages. It doesn't do Polish because the Royal Charter says only the native British languages. So there's no, it's tricky, even though the audience would be enormous. It doesn't have the permission to do it. So there's English, Welsh, Gaelic, and BSL. They're native British languages. So you support the 4. And so you might turn around and say, right, okay, is this for small children? Are we building a news application for the under 5s? And someone go, no, that's ridiculous. Okay, fine. We're not designing for them. We are willing to exclude them. And in fact, this may contain war reports and, details of rape cases or all sorts of stuff that we don't want kids accessing. So we might want to actively exclude them as well. So exclusion is okay, or it's geo-locked. So we're willing to exclude anyone outside the UK because that's the permissions and the context of it. And you start creating a list of all of the people, and then you get to the next list and go, everyone who's not on the first list, we have to consider in our design approach. And it's like, what are the things that if we don't get this right to begin with, we're going to create barriers for them, and it's going to be really hard at the end to get them back in again. And you don't want Gareth again, it's just once. That's enough, please.
No, but that's exactly. No, but that's quite interesting. That willingness to exclude because you're working towards something, and you do want to make it accessible, or let's say accessible for the actual targets that you want to be the audience. You want your audience to be accessible, right?
Because you're building, maybe it's a website, and you're building a website that's sitting on, another organization has designed the device, another organization may, and there's they've designed the operating system. Someone else may have designed the browser. Someone else may have created the assistive technology that plug in. You've got no control over any of this. And there's the data network. Will it fail? Will the JavaScript load? Who knows? So you do what is in your gift to do, because the rest of it can still fail and there's nothing you can do about it. But you're aware of those.
But being aware of that, I do think that structurally speaking, like the accessibility should be that fundamental. Fundamental in both meanings, right? It's essential in a sense, and fundamental in the sort of basic, to be in the like we said, in the planning stage, but even before, in the ideation stage of what we want to do, right? Because we do need to make this available for everyone. And let me just segue into something else that I read. You were responding to someone's article, and you were
Is this grumpy, Gareth?
No. I mean, Let's be honest. It was grumpy, but it so happens that I do tend to agree with you, because there is a difference between people with disability and people that actually use assistive technology. And you were mentioning that who are the people we are targeting? Are they people with disability? And if so, medical disability, social disability, or are they just using assistive technology? And you gave the example of captions that are used for so many people that do not have an, let's say, acknowledged disability. So that kind of goes into what you're saying. That we do need to know the audience, but we don't know who's going to use it. We don't know who's using what we are providing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And people are complicated. We like to put people in boxes, and it doesn't work that way. And everyone then has a preconceived idea about people and their abilities and all. A label gets landed, and I find the word disability and even the word accessibility at times hugely problematic, because they're very loaded terms. They come with bias. Whether it's unconscious or conscious bias, sometimes it's conscious, but mostly unconscious biases. And people immediately start making assumptions, and often the wrong assumptions about people because of a label that's been attached to them. And you see this all over the place. And I think a lot of it, it's cultural, and in some ways it's kind of getting fixed. I blame my generation. I'm not saying how old you are, but I know how old I am, and
slightly younger.
Slightly younger. I was born in the 60s. I don't know where you were born.
The 80s. So it's not my fault. It's not my fault.
You're a child.
I'll take it.
Take that.
By the way, just so you know, GPT couldn't find your age anywhere in the internet.
Thank you. Well, I've already given it away because
I'll mute it. No
subtitles. It's the real.
I'll take it off.
Yeah, I don't mind. I'm quite proud of it, but it's really funny because we have these assumptions. We have and it comes, and I think I see my upbringing as privileged for my generation, because most disabled kids or kids with, conditions, were taken out of mainstream education in the 60s and 70s. They went to special schools, or basically dropped out because they were unsupported if they were in the classroom because of being neurodivergent and stuff. And there was no support, or there was limited support for them. And so, and they, people become, isolated within spaces. But I think the thing is, lots of people grew up not knowing disabled people because they were taken away. They were taken out of their communities. And I can see why the thinking at the time was to give people particular support. But then it creates a longer term problem. It's the difference between accessible games and inclusive gaming. There was a massive problem. This is something we messed up in the early days. And so, just for the record, the BBC was the first ever games publisher to have games accessibility guidelines. So I went to find the person that made those CBeebies games that my son could play, and this guy called Ian Hamilton. He was a designer. There was a couple of people who were doing this as a project. I think it's Cecilia Weiss, I think her name was, but it's Cecilia. I'm sure it was Cecilia. Ian will correct me next time I speak to him. But he was, and they were there in children's building accessible, Switch games and stuff. They were experimenting in a space they've been allowed to, and it was amazing. And now, so I ended up getting a group together around this and saying, right, what do we know? What's already out there, what's going on, and what can we capture? And we started building the first publisher-led games accessibility guidelines, which then became the basis of gamesaccessibilityguidelines.com, which the whole industry now uses. And we found out there was a guy called Barry Ellis who was, hacking really early video games for disabled kids and creating stuff. And there were these pockets of people out there with brilliance. It's like, what can we learn? Let's pull this together. Let's work out the practice, and then let's try this out. But you fall into the problem is you end up making games and mainstream games and accessible games. And the reason that was massively problematic, even if the games worked and were fun, which is amazing how many accessible games were not fun. They were rubbish, but they were, they were terribly boring, but accessible. But it was like, we've kind of got over that now. But the interesting thing was, we were then, when we went out and started studying this, we realized we were creating a social problem, because kids like to talk about the games that they were playing. And so there's a friendship group and they're all talking about it. And this one kid who can't play the game that everyone else is playing and playing his other games is then left out of the conversation. And so it's like, right, we need to change our approach here. We need to then build it into everything. So it becomes, how inclusive can we make every type of game? We need all the kids playing together. And rather than, we're doing the segregation thing, we're doing what they did in education, and that created problems. So I see myself, I had a very privileged upbringing, but most people didn't in that sense. And so then you get the nervousness and the worry, and I don't want to do the wrong thing, so I'll end up doing nothing. And, and that has created a legacy of problems. And now, more disabled and neurodivergent kids are in mainstream education and have more diverse friendship groups. And, so from a societal point of view, we're kind of patching the problem well. But, people like me are still here. Yeah, we're still knocking around and still struggling.
Yeah, and I do think that we are walking in strides, especially in terms of gaming. I remember The Last of Us for the PS5 when a friend of mine just kind of gave me the controller, said now play, and I said I can't. No, yes you can. And the thing starts talking and starts guiding me through things. And I just heard the other day that a game for blind people just won App of the Year on the App Store, right? I think it's called Land of Livia. So I mean, things are progressing, and that conversation that you were saying, kids are now being able to be included, or are able to be part of the conversation.
And this is great, because this then becomes just about people again, because I think even the concept of a disabled person as an identity is a 20th century idea. Before that, you were just a person without an arm. You look back in the work, into the Tudor times and Shakespearean times, and Richard III is just a character. He's probably the first play ever written about ableism. He suffers ableism because how he looks, and his mother is, and the insults and attitudes towards him. It's fascinating play when you look at it, and it explores ableism. It's not an ableist play. It's a play about ableism. But there are other characters in the Shakespearean canon which are disabled. But no one says, Shakespeare nowhere, or any other playwright that co-wrote some of them, which we know that happened, like Marlowe and stuff. But they never say this is a disabled character. I think there's about 23 of them. But when you look into it, I think his name's Hobbo. I'm going to get this probably awfully wrong. In Merchant of Venice, so there's a character called Hobbo, and there's two reasons why we know he's disabled. The first one we know he's disabled is because he is a fool, and a fool was often a disabled person. There were two lots of fools. There were natural fools and fools. Natural fools were often people with, and this was a role of importance in a court. It was a very high standing role. And often disabled people, I mean, this is the kind of ableist thing that is, but take this as a hostile thing, not seen as a threat. You're as a role, but you are allowed to be the only critical voice in the room. You can mock the person in power for their bad decisions and question them. You knew there was a line. You had to be clever and intelligent. You knew there was a line that you could overstep, but you were there almost to make the person in power think, because all the people around them won't question them because they want to keep their heads. You are the one that's allowed. Your role is often disabled people. Natural fools are often people with learning disability. I think Henry VIII had two, but they became almost like extensions of the family. You were adopted into a rich family to become just almost like someone that's nice.
Mm-hmm.
It's like as a role. Yeah.
No, but it's interesting. That's what you're saying. Yeah, like it. That's what you're saying. Like we've went from people with some sort of, like, without an arm, without a leg, to people with disability or disabled person. Yeah, as an identity, and only now are we trying to kind of leave that behind us. And I was very fortunate to have lived. I was visually impaired since birth, but I had never had any contact with anyone else that was also. Only when I was like 26 did I started to understand that there were other people like me that do some other things, and I was very fortunate for my upbringing, because I was brought up with no, let's say, there were no impossibles. Yeah, let's play ball. Let's ride the bicycle. Sure. Slower, just a little slower than my friend.
Yeah, let's do this and let's find out. And
exactly. That's it. So
it was amazing. We worry about these things so much, and I think it is a generational problem. But I think being a disabled person is an important identity. I think it's for a lot of people. Not everyone identifies as having a disability. I think more people who are born with conditions are more likely, or it's something has happened earlier on in their life, later on in life, is as thinking about someone. There's still stigma left over from my generation and older, and there's still issues around this. But I think probably the First and Second World War created a lot more disabled people than there were. And things started changing, and we've got better healthcare, and because this is the thing, it would have been more common back then. Because there was more disease, there was poor healthcare, poor sanitation, lots of injuries at work because there was no protection. And you just, I've lost some fingers, but I'll strap it up and I'm back at work tomorrow. I'm now just a person with fewer fingers. And so it was one of those things where, there was some, it was pointed out to me. So my son, Zach's an actor, and I do go on about him a hell of a lot. And, but so he now does stuff. He went to drama school, and his movement teacher told him something, and they were looking at period dance. And she said, it's quite an interesting thing to look at period dance. She said, why do you think it's so simple? People line up, they step towards each other, they step back, go around each other quite slowly, have a bit of a chat. She was like, probably because there were more people with mobility impairments in that group than there are now.
That's an amazing perspective. I love that.
And, there were dancers. and they did that. They did the really things, but with groups and stuff, and it was great. You had to then collect the whole group.
No one was doing the salsa back then. Yeah.
No, it was just like there's a good chance, but this was more. It was just more common. And I think I remember the thing about Hobbo as well, the other bit, because I said about his role, but the name is interesting because what I understand is it's from Tudor period. It's an Italian slang word for hunchback, and so Shakespeare is turning around and saying this person has a condition. I've named them I've given you the clues. I've given you their position. But because there's no this person is disabled, everyone then casts that person as non-disabled because we have this modern mindset of it has to be called out, it has to be identified, and it's like doesn't translate particularly well into text. But anyway, that's a kind of sideline. But it's a thing. We have to kind of have both views sometimes. This is just people with characteristics. It's just people with conditions or an impairment that if we don't consider this, we create the barrier. It's the social model, isn't it? It's impairment plus environment equals disability. I think that's the simple maths of it.
No, yeah, that's absolutely, and that's an amazing segue, and you're going to love this one because we're focusing on people. And like, do you think that the EAA is is going to be beneficial for people or just for companies that want to be compliant with something? See how
right.
I did that?
Well, I mean, this is something that's going to take a little while to figure out. I mean, the EAA. The more I've spent a long time, I can't remember how many times I've read it. I spend a lot of time poring over it and thinking about it and finding out a little bit more about it, because to understand any kind of regulatory framework, you also need to understand the way it's governed. And the way that it's governed and what it says gives you a clue about what you need to do. You can't just take the regulatory framework and assume that you understand. And you also can't bring any preconceived ideas to it, which I think is happening a lot. So EAA is fascinating. It doesn't directly relate to EN 301549 or WCAG in any way. I think it mentions that there are. I think it just assumes that people are using. I think what we call voluntary standards. It's there's no mandate for these things. You could use anything as long as
the outcome.
The outcome. Now the outcomes are fascinating as well within this, and I've just spent 2 hours debating this with someone else today, and it's interesting.
I'm so sorry about that.
No, because it's actually helped me now, because I thought I understood them until a session with Susanna Laurin, and she started talking about the way it would be governed potentially in the way that this is being approached, because it's uniform across all the states. There's no change. Domestic law does not impact on the EAA. The EAA is just the EAA. If there are additional laws, there are additional laws, but the EAA is uniform. But the way that she was talking about it being governed was in the way that other the regulatory bodies work. So usually, I mean, and this is a massive scale. This is a huge scale. I think it's a massively ambitious piece of lawmaking, of legislation. It's very clever. It's also a little bit obtuse in places and a little bit complicated, but I think it needs to be. It doesn't back itself into any corners for a start. It doesn't, other bits of, legislation in the past have said, you need to do WCAG 2.1. And it's like, what happens when 2.2 comes out? We're a bit stuffed then. We're stuck now. We're going to do 2 versions of the same standard. So it's not backed itself into any corners by being overly committal or draconian in any way. And I think I honestly think it's the most equal form of equality legislation I've yet read, because it goes through some. Annex 1 is a brilliant read. It's although it's slightly frustrating because the requirements are actually embedded in 3 different parts of it. It says these are the requirements, and then it says and then these, and then we've embedded a few of them over here as well. And so it's a bit tricky to pull out. But once you've extracted them, you can start understanding the requirements. But it gives you a load of things that are very sensible outcomes around things that you expect to do, and then it gives you a list of people that those outcomes there should be some kind of comparative or comparable outcome for all of them. It doesn't say this lot of disabled people are more important than that lot of disabled are more. And there are other regulations out there that don't have, even if they're not explicit, they're implicit hierarchies within them because of the weighting that they give to certain things. And you're there going, who I can read by reading this, I can work out who was in the room. It's because it's not weighted. It's not weighted, and WCAG itself is not weighted in an equal way. We talk about the 20%, but we don't always talk about the 20%. But I think then some people experience more particular and profound barriers if not considered. So it is a balancing and juggling act around it. But I really quite like the EAA because once you pull all that out and you start looking, and it goes back to the 4 principles in WCAG, which are explicit. But there's a 5th one that's implicit in it. And even though quality is not in the act, by no means, and I always find that's quite interesting, because they always say, you can't actually spell the word equality without spelling the word quality. There's only one letter difference between them. And actually they mean fairly similar things, different contexts, but they're a very similar idea. But quality is not actually called out in the act. But if you look at the governance, or what's being talked around the governance, is that organizations will self-report. And if they don't provide a report, they will probably be asked to provide a report. And if that report seems fine and fair and things are ongoing, then there's no problem. And they're not expected to fix everything. It's new things and about approaches and about data and all the rest of it, which is kind of good. It gives it, and there's no format for this yet. This is all going to come out in the wash. We're going to work out what that is. And because it's very much about outcomes rather than approach, because WCAG is an approach, it's not an outcome. It's all about anything that's a checklist is an approach. Only a person can tell you if they were able to perceive, operate, understand something, and if it worked well with their technology. You can't assume that by hitting a checklist, because you are going to be wrong. So there is going to be
more often than not.
Yeah, so we need technical data, and we need user data, and some degree somewhere along these lines to be able to honestly say that we've sort of delivered something that's in the spirit of the legislation. But then in the other part of the governance, and this was something that was interesting that Susanna Laurin said, and I'm going to probably misquote her in a lot of ways because I can't remember the exact wording. Sorry, Susanna. But she said, one of the things that's going to be quite important is that these authorities will exist within, sort of whatever government authorities will be that will be not monitoring, but sort of regulating. And you can, like everything, like complaining about your electricity provider or whatever, you go to the regulatory authority, and it's going to be, a lot of it is going to be dependent on complaints. So if people complain and say, I'm trying to buy some trousers and they won't let me, that's kind of, and I've met disabled people and they wear trousers. Well, hopefully, like all of us, well, they get arrested. It's, you can wear other things, dresses, kilts, skirts.
Yeah,
sorry,
whatever tickles their fancy, right?
If we're dealing with complaints, the logic follows. Why do people complain? It's because something wasn't of a quality that they expected. I expect, and quality of delivery means I can do this. Quality of user experience. I don't want to spend 5 hours trying to do a checkout. I was able to do it, but it's appalling quality. I'm still being excluded, and that is a problem. And if they're going to bring that in, then you've got this you've got the 5th principle, which is satisfactory. If something isn't satisfactory as well from a user experience point of view, if something isn't satisfactory and it's not necessary, they're not coming back. It doesn't matter how PO you are. If the thing is supposed to be a service that you enjoy, like shopping or VOD services or gaming or whatever, and they've not enjoyed it, they're not coming back.
No, absolutely. But for me, the premise, or let's say the premise that people need to complain for something to get fixed or for something to get flagged.
Or something
for
to
me,
be investigated.
Or at least investigated. But for me, that's a flawed premise, because it shouldn't have to be like that. For me, the EAA should not be reliant on complaints. They should have to be enforced, like we said before, fundamentally enforced.
Yeah.
And I know that kind of relies on some kind of user feedback. And I do know, and I know that you have a solution for that. At least you're trying to provide a solution for that.
I would not turn around and say I'm turning up with the magic bullet for the EAA, because I don't think there is one. But the thing is, I think user feedback needs to be part of it for an organisation to know if you took risks if you say complaints are a risk, is if they complain, because this is the way it happens with television or whatever, is that something is, people decide that they're unhappy about something that was broadcasted. They go to the regulatory authority. They get 30 or 40 complaints in, and I know that Ofcom, or the BBC when I was there, if we got 20 complaints, add an extra 0 or even 2 zeros to that of the people who are actually probably impacted or felt that way. Could be even more. But there will be, you don't need many complaints to launch an investigation. And so you triage it, you look at it and go, is this people who are really impacted, or is this just people with an opinion? Because often with accessibility, that's the first point of call. Is this someone who just thinks they know about accessibility, or is this someone who's actually experienced the barrier? If it's someone who's got an opinion, that's less likely to be acted upon. But if it's someone who, right, okay, we've negatively impacted on someone's life here, we need to immediately priority right at the top. And so, that then sparks a conversation between the regulatory authority and the service provider, and they go, we need to know more because people are unhappy about this. Tell us what you're doing. If they're unhappy with the response, then enforcement comes in, and then it can work its way towards fines. And by the looks of it, the EAA fines could be very substantial, depending on the country that this is coming from, the member state it's coming from. But these could be incredibly substantial, and you could even get shut down, as far as, or your site blocked. It's interesting to see, that how, if we ever go there, I don't know, but there is a potential to go there. There is a path there's never been before. And this is going to be a fascinating, get a big bucket of popcorn and sit back and let's see what happens. Because,
but you sound optimistic. For some reason, I'm listening to you and you sound optimistic about this.
Well, it works in other fields, and I've seen it work in broadcast. I mean, It's interesting because it's kind of had to work in this space, but you also see where it's never had to work. So go to games. The games industry don't want a WCAG, and they don't want regulation because they've found a way of doing it without it. They are quite unique in the fact that community has driven change within the games industry. Unlike anything else, if you brought in any kind of regulated standards for gaming against it, you would probably do more damage than good, because they are flying as far as inclusion is concerned, and they put everything else to shame in the level in the speed and commitment and just the way that they've treated it as fun and interesting, and it's brilliant. It's an amazing group of people. But other places, I think, struggle a lot with this, and it's probably also because of age, and going back to that whole problem is you've got probably a younger community driving the game, and they're like, well, the hell not, let's just do it. Far more positive. So I think you see other things like various industries and their regulations. Some of them work very well, some of them don't work very well, but there are a lot of models where this has worked extremely well. I think to be able to proactively do it, you've got a scale problem, because if you're dealing with regulating 1,000, 2,000 energy companies, that's one level of scale, and that's hard. But we are talking hundreds of thousands, if not more. We could be in the millions of organizations or websites or whatever that could come under this, because it's not just organizations in the member states, it's organizations selling into the member states. The scope is massive. So to proactively regulate that is probably impossible. We don't have the data, the tools, or anything. But I think organizations should be looking at this and going, well, the point, okay, we've got to supply a report saying how we're approaching this, where we're at, and all the rest of it, which is good, which shows, It shows that things are in motion, things are being taken seriously and being delivered and being thought about. But I think the organizations need to think about complaints as the biggest risk and say, how do you know things? So you need user data. You need to know, are people happy? And you need to know, you need to be able to segment by need, and this is a big GDPR problem, which is why, but yeah, this is why it was one of the projects. I mean, leaving the BBC was a fascinating one. I'm going to go into anecdote mode. So
feel free.
There was always bits and pieces. I wasn't just the manager at the BBC, so I used to get involved in certain things. And there's certain things. I mean, this is with every accessibility team. The strengths and weaknesses, and some people have got specialisms, and other people have got other specialisms, and and accessibility is such a massive topic. Nobody knows it all. It's impossible. You need lots of different perspectives, and some people are designers, some people are very convergent thinkers, some people are divergent thinkers, some people really get the engineering side of it, other people it's about user experience, and or it could be about content production. I was very much into still with my brand manager head on, branding systems and fonts and that kind of stuff, and going into the emotional data has always been a big part of my thinking and my approach. And so I'd get involved in other stuff, but you know your limitations, and you know who to listen to, who to ask questions to, and you formulate opinions. And so a couple of so I worked with an amazing team of people who was sort of co-led with Bruno Marg, who was the font designer, and David Bailey, who's an incredible typographer and visual designer. Designers will know, anyone who's done communication design who's listening to this should know who David Bailey is, and Designers Republic were in the 90s. So that's where he came from. So the three of us sort of drove Reed. Very different perspectives. We came from very different places, and we did this big piece of work, and then we formed a thing called the Readability Group, which was which was four of us. Michael Matthews joined us, who's a brilliant accessibility research engineer, and we did this massive study at the beginning of lockdown. We all needed hobbies during lockdown. You dusted off the guitar.
Definitely.
I tried to build a modular synthesizer and failed. And but this was one that we really committed to, because AXCON was going to happen, and we were like, let's do a study for that. Let's submit a paper. And so we did the largest ever study on readability and legibility of fonts, and to create a massive data set. We didn't turn up with a hypothesis. We were just like, let's capture so much data to such a degree of richness we can ask interesting questions. And and that was the whole thing. And we ended up, I think it was 2,500 participants took part in a massive data set, and we looked at vision impairment and dyslexia, and people who struggle with contrast, and people who don't have any particular struggle around it, and captured tons of stuff around the font features and stuff. And this data set is, there's a project I'm trying to get launched off the back of that at the minute, which is kind of interesting, but I'm not going to talk about it because that's a whole other podcast. But I got involved. But David and I then went on to do loads of work on where he sort of kicked off really the rebranding of the BBC off that, because you start with the font, it's the foundation of your branding system, and then we were like, now we've done that. It took 2.5 years to do that, because fonts get used, they're so complicated, and we had to do an Arabic version, they had to be Cyrillic, had to cover all the Nordic languages, and and it was a massive job, and children's different reading ages and abilities, they had to cover all sorts of stuff, and still look like it was a British media organisation with a digital presence. It still had to have the emotional accessibility in there. It still had to be on brand. And so off the back of that, it's like, let's do the branding system. And that was the last project I was directly involved in at the back of this. But just to explain to everyone who can see me, if you can see me on this podcast, is I do not have the ability to teleport.
Not yet.
ChatGPT missed out on that bit. It's
exactly.
But if you
we do.
If you publish a transcript of this, just say Gareth has the ability to teleport.
Definitely, yeah. So when the next time someone looks for you, researches you, it says that. So it's ADHD and the ability to teleport. That sounds amazing. That sounds amazing.
That'd be absolutely brilliant.
No.
Let's mess with their data. So
definitely.
So I think something I was saying, but branding. So branding system.
Yeah.
So it's a big thing for me. Yeah. But the thing is, brands are promises, and so very much about, everything needs to be delivered to meet the promise of what the organization says. And I always look at mission statements and brand values and things. If this is where you should always find inclusion. And I start diving into these things because the amount of organizations that have inclusion written in them, they say things like, yeah, we are for everyone and blah, blah, we do this and we do that. And it's like, well, where does it say accept them? Where do we descope people? And I always see things like the products, that kind of functional accessibility is the vehicle for the emotion accessibility. The two things have to work slightly separately, but you still need to be able to deliver this in a way that makes sense. And I had the pleasure of working with Diageo for a couple of years. They were a really, really good fun organization to work with. And they very much focused on accessibility as brand and not as compliance. Compliance was kind of like a side discussion over there somewhere because that wasn't interesting. What was interesting was brand. And they have 200 odd brands and mostly alcoholic. So everything, yeah. Which is an interesting thing in itself because it's a disabling product,
Yes, depending on a few factors, but yes, I tend to agree.
Absolutely, yeah, particularly around motor and cognition, and there are two things that can definitely be impacted. So very social model, but it's the thing that was interesting with them is that we would talk about this because I can't remember the name of the chap it might be Jeremy Lenley, who's the like chief design officer for all their products. And he was just explaining to me, he said, diversity is such an important thing to them because groups are families and friendship groups and working groups. And, people consume the products usually as part of a social thing. People are going out together, celebrating something, commiserating something, whatever. It happens all sorts. So often this is about people togetherness. And he went, and all groups are diverse. So if we don't deal with diversity and inclusion in as part of that brand, then we become a little bit less relevant to our customers. We have to be there. And I was like, that's so refreshing.
No, absolutely, and of course, I mean, of course, especially the community and myself being visually impaired or being blind or whatever you want to call it, I do tend to look at brands that kind of have that statement in a different way. But on the other hand, when they do have that statement, I find myself being much more demanding on them than on a brand that does not have that statement. It's a curious thing, right?
No, I think that's completely logical because if you make a promise, you need to keep it, and that's the thing with brands. And I think this is if an organization is making a promise about itself and promising something, then you judge it by its delivery. And this is where, what was it? Was it Domino's Pizzas? That was fascinating with that case because, and I've got it somewhere. I took a snapshot of their brand values at the beginning of the case, and they talked about community. They talked about everyone being included. By the end of the case, they changed their mission statement and removed all the inclusion out of it. I went, well, that's interesting because, and you now know that you've overpromised. It's and you weren't whether you were willing or not to meet the promise of your brand, but you've damaged the brand in the process, and I think it's, of course, as a customer, you're giving them money, they're promising something to you. I think you should be demanding, and I think this is why, in some ways, this governance of the EAA and the brand promise of delivery and inclusion. I think people will, I think it's going to be good when people do complain. If stuff does come in, I think it's handing power to people because before, what do? You complain to the organization and they mark their own homework. Now you've got an organization who you can complain to, who can genuinely hold them to account. And before, we've never had that before. This is new. This is absolutely amazing. And that's, I think it's going to be down to the community to utilize this as an opportunity for change. But we are going to have to get behind it, and not only within the organizations, but as consumers as well. Consumer groups then demanding change of organizations and using this legislation will be whether this thing works or not. It's handing power to people. Are they prepared to use it?
Mm-hmm. Or even knowledgeable to use it, because again, that's the thing, right? Does the community, first of all, does the community know that something like the EAA is coming? That's one thing, because I bet that most people don't know. And the other is, even if they know, what is the process? What is the how can they kind of make their complaints or make their feedback known to the organization, or to the organization that's going to follow up on that, right? And I see that with the ADA, right? It was the same thing, or it still is the same thing. How is the ADA going to be? Sorry, how is the EAA going to be used in that sense? Are the lawyers all of a sudden going to come up and find ways to sue websites?
But they don't need to anymore, because you've got a regulatory body that will do that for you. I mean, this gets us around litigation. It's litigation is the American way. Litigation is not the European way. How many people get sued? Right. No one does. Yeah. It's very.
I was going to ask you about. Do you think that the EAA is an improvement of the ADA? How do you see those two things?
Huge improvement. Absolutely amazing. Huge. It encompasses. It encompasses so many more aspects of user experience. For me, I think the ADA had an enormous amount of promise, and it was an early piece of legislation, and this is it. It's always better. It's always easier to look at what's gone before and improve on it. And I think the EAA has done this in leaps and bounds, but there's other bits of regulation that have happened before, and a lot of discussion over the years. And there's bits of American legislation in 508 and stuff which just gets ignored. The fact that Section 508 has the word usable in it, and nobody does any usability testing with disabled people in the procurement process, it's like the most ignored word. And they just go back to compliance testing. But I think you also then need to do task analysis, because one of the members of my team at the time, Jack, who's now at Barclays, absolutely brilliant engineer. Jack's blind, the screen reader user. And so I can't remember what system we were looking at one day. It was a taxi booking system or something. And I was like, well, this is compliant, but it takes me 5 minutes to book a taxi, and it takes Jack 15 minutes to book the same taxi. And that's crap. So where does he get the other 10 minutes from? Is he supposed to take fewer and shorter breaks? Is he supposed to be less productive? Does he stay 10 minutes later in the day to make up for the 10 minutes? And what about all the other systems that impact on him? This is not, and they're all compliant, but they are all unusable. And so therefore, whereas I think with the EAA, thinking more about, the way that they've dealt with this in a very even hand, the way that we've brought in complaints as part of the governance process, the way that it's less of a box ticking exercise, and that leads to nasty letters in the post that you pay a few grand to make go away. That's what happens in the US. I think the way that they've thought about this is the way that escalation goes through a regulatory body that will do the chasing for you. You don't have to go to court. You don't have to get funded. You don't have to go through all that pain. They're going to do the legwork. You just need to get together as a group and give them the evidence to do that, and just say, look, this is ridiculous. There's, there's a community here. Lobby groups. This is a gift for them. Will they take it? It's and if it's utilized brilliantly, then that's fantastic. It's the one thing when I was at the BBC, every single time I spoke publicly, I'd go around and say, please complain, because honestly, there's a page over there. It was the first page that we fixed all the accessibility issues on the first time. Because they're already annoyed by the time they've got to the complaints form. We don't want to annoy them even more. Okay, so please complain, because if you don't complain, we assume you're happy. We're going to do everything in our gift to do from where we're saying, but we don't know whether it was successful until you tell us, because you're the customer. And if you're not happy, we'll listen, because we have to, because, that's the way that we are built as an organization. And the BBC get about 3,000 to 5,000 correspondents a day. It was an enormous amount. There's a big team that would triage that. And if it was genuinely a person having a genuine problem, honestly, everything got sort of immediately investigated. We'd contact them and go, how's that working? What are you doing? What's the system? We need to recreate this. Things would change. But if people didn't utilize the process that they've got, then it became very hard to manage, because everyone would think everything's fixed and fabulous. And, you shouldn't have to complain, but there's always going to be problems that the organization hasn't spotted. And if it's an organization that wants to continuously improve, it really needs this. So complain, use the system that you've got. EAA is an open door for change. It's not the change itself, it's the catalyst for change. It's up to us as a community, to grasp that and go, yeah, let's use it. It's a new tool in the box. It's fabulous.
Totally agree, and that would be an amazing way to end the podcast. But I do still have a few more questions, so you're not.
I'm not getting off yet. Not that easily.
Okay, yeah, exactly. Not after your teleporting stunt. So, that's amazing. My question is, will that be done in at a member state level, at a country level? Or will everything be funneled into this European?
I think it's all being done by the individual member states. So I think that the law remains the same from every member state, but how it's regulated is down to the member state. But it has to be regulated, and so this is going to be the interesting thing to see how that pans out. Who sets up what? I think it's up to the community outside of these and outside of this to engage with that, and if it isn't satisfactory the way that they're doing, then complain about that. I think sometimes it's good. Complaints are useful, and it is tiring. You don't want to complain about everything in your life, but this is the point
choose your battles.
Choose your battles, and these are battles that are well worth choosing. Yeah. You've finally got something in here that could actually work.
I'm going to be honest with you. I've been reading about the EAA and the EAA itself, and getting some feedback from the community, and I've never been so optimistic about that as of now. As I hear you talk about it, and I do feel hopeful, and I feel optimistic about what's to come. I do think about the way that, for example, Portugal does things with the gold, silver, and bronze medal for the WCAG compliance, and the focus groups that we had to do to give that to brands. And I'm hopeful that we're going to scrap everything, all that, and put something in place that actually works, or at least that's something that allows that
to happen. It's now a possibility,
yeah, exactly.
and it's a well thought through one. And I'm again, one of the things at the BBC is I used to spend a lot of time talking to the lobby groups. So we had a wonderful corporate relations team, and so we would have this regular dialogue with lobby groups and large charities with large memberships, because we knew if we got 2 or 3 complaints from a certain user group, we would go to the representative groups and go, can you ask your membership about this, because we want to know the scale of the impact on this. Can you help us get better data? We're going to try and do what we can. Let's get together and do this as a collaborative thing. And I met some brilliant lobbyists, some terrible lobbyists in my time. But one of these days I'm going to write a guide of how to lobby, because I was always on the other receiving end, and the ones that did it well were brilliant. And they usually turned up, and they knew your technology. They'd done so much homework. They knew your service. They knew the things that were not possible. And they were like, I have to ask this, but I'm pretty sure the answer is, not in this decade. But it's like, but I want to know whether I've got this right. And they would come and they would ask really good questions, and you loved having them in there because it kept the dialogue going at a senior level. And and this was exact because when the lobby groups come in, the CEO wants to come in, and
Yeah,
there
they
was
pay
even
attention. Yeah.
yeah, they pay attention, and but you have to then frame that discussion and make sure it's meaningful and make sure everyone gets something out of it. Yeah, and I thoroughly enjoyed that part of the work. But sometimes people just turned up angry, and and they would start demanding things, and it was like, oh, how do you think that's actually going to happen? Because I don't think no one's come up with a solution for that yet in the world. So, much that I'd love to be able to do that, I don't think it's possible. It's and that was always a problematic thing because then you'd send them away angry and upset and maybe a little bit humiliated, and you didn't want to do that. It's like, can't we get you instead of that? Love to have a discussion about you, but there's things over here that we got a feeling could be better, and you might be able to help us understand what it is that we would need to do from the user's point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that inclusion of people that are actually going to use the either is the technology or it's amazing. And there's a whole discussion around the visually impaired community, which is there's so much assistive technology that is built. Like I would say, not daily but monthly.
Yeah.
There's everything is popping up. But most of them don't ask people if we need it. Don't ask us if we want it or if it actually makes sense for us. So we end up with things that the idea is good, but the execution or the real world application is just not there. And then it just falls apart. So,
someone said to me many years ago that a screen reader was a sighted person's solution to blind people's access. And I don't know, I wouldn't say that's necessarily true, but I think they were more talking about the design of some of the early screen readers. And particularly, but I mean, and going back in the day, you've got people like Chieko Asakawa at IBM, who was, an absolute, one of the most amazing people who's worked in accessibility going, she used to code and working on old mainframes back in the previous century, and she used to code. She was blind, and she would code by dictating her code to someone who would type it in for her. It's mad. I mean, it's extraordinary. And then she got so sick of doing this, she built her own screen reader. Brain the size of a planet to be able to do that. I met her once, and it was one of the most humbling experiences in my life. Because you meet someone who's that clever, and you just think, everything I say, I'm going to sound like a complete idiot.
Yeah, humbling experience indeed. Absolutely.
She was so nice and so pleasant and very, very complimentary of the BBC stuff at the time. She's like, yeah, I've come along and I've started using your things. And I was like, oh no, I really hope. And I had a list of pages and products that I was like, I really hope she didn't go there. We're still a way off fixing that. And luckily, the stuff that she was very complimentary, and she gave a couple of really interesting insights about ways.
Great stuff.
But getting back to that promise, if an organization makes that promise and it is not delivering it, the EAA becomes our vehicle for expressing our displeasure
and exactly, and making sure we're heard. That's amazing stuff.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm drawing way too many parallels and comparisons and things here, but this is how my brain's coming together with this. And I think this is potentially in one of the smartest bits of legislation in that context that there's been, but it's going to evolve.
Yeah,
and let's see where it goes.
Absolutely. And I like what you're saying. It really depends on us, and for some reason that kind of gives me also some kind of hope that if it's up to us, the communities throughout Europe, then maybe something good will come out of this. And we'll make sure that everything.
The only thing that will ruin this is apathy. If we expect it just to happen, it will never happen. People have turned around and said the doors are all open now. Yeah. Do you want to go through them? I'm not going to push you through them. We've got to go through them and choose to do it and work with organisations, and and that whole, and going back to the BBC, that whole relationship through Ofcom, who was the regulatory body, who were often involved in the conversations, and and the relationship with the licence fee payers of the BBC, which is the sort of open tax for the BBC, that pays for its existence. That is what has driven change in the organisation more than anything else. It's not a compliance thing. It wasn't down to regulation. And actually, it's really interesting because the things that over the decades that have come out of those discussions have actually formed very sensible regulations.
Okay, yeah. So something good came out of all that discussion and all that.
Absolutely.
Amazing stuff.
Yeah.
Amazing stuff, Gareth. No, it's like, look, I would stay here talking to you about this for hours, unfortunately. I'm sure you have better things to do.
I'm thoroughly enjoying myself. Don't worry about it.
Amazing stuff. Gareth, thank you so much for this chat, for this conversation around accessibility. And don't worry, you'll be back for sure.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
Amazing stuff, guys. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. So many interesting things to pick up on, and it's always a pleasure to speak with Gareth. Don't forget to subscribe where you get your podcast, at Apple, Android, wherever tickles your fancy, and hope to see you next time. Cheers.